Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. If you're a student of fashion history, The Journey of Punk is absolutely essential reading. We're not just rehashing the safety pins and torn plaid of 70s London today, though. We're diving into a fascinating study of cultural adaptation, specifically how the raw, unfiltered aggression of global punk was totally reimagined into a highly sophisticated and uniquely Japanese art form. Let's get into it. To really grasp this evolution, we've got to ask ourselves a pretty massive question. How exactly does a society that's practically built on strict rules and social harmony absorb the world's most rebellious subculture? I mean, it's a huge paradox, but it's exactly what makes Japanese punk so incredibly compelling. There's a famous Japanese proverb that hits the nail on the head here. Literally, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. This completely captures the intense societal tension setting the stage for our story. In post-war Japan, conformity wasn't just, a polite suggestion. It was the absolute foundation of their economic miracle. Sticking out invited severe social punishment. But despite all that, some youth decided to become the absolute sharpest, most jagged nails imaginable. So here's our syllabus for today's explainer. We'll be hitting 5 key areas. First, the British spark arrives. Second, Job Corps' primal scream. Third, street style and DIY. Fourth, architects of fashion descent. And finally, a permanent design language. Okay, part 1. The British spark arrives. Let's look at exactly how those initial seeds of dissent were planted. Now, Japan actually had its own underground agitators way before the safety pin era. Back in the 60s and 70s, radical student movements and proto-punk bands like Zuno Keisatsu were already laying the groundwork. But the arrival of British punk, that was the ultimate catalyst. When the Sex Pistols' music hit Tokyo in 1977 and acts like The Clash and The Damned started filtering through, it sparked this massive DIY ethos. By the 1980s, that energy had exploded into a purely homegrown scene led by local bands like The Stalin. And here is where we see a truly fascinating contrast. Think about Western punk for a second. It erupted out of mass unemployment and deindustrialization. It was this outward political rage against a failing economic system, right? But Japanese punk? Completely different beast. Japan was actively entering its massive bubble economy. So rather than fighting poverty, Japanese youth turned that punk energy inward. It became this intense survival mechanism against suffocating academic pressure, rigid social expectations, and a hyper-productive consumerist boom. Which brings us to part 2, Jap Corps' primal scream. Let's see how this tension manifested down in the underground. So the crucial thing to understand here is that what became known as Jap Corps was literally a primal scream. We're not just talking about standard 3-chord punk. Bands like Gizm, Gauze, and Lip Cream pushed the sound to absolute extremes. It was faster, harsher, almost ritualistic. It functioned as this incredibly aggressive yet weirdly precise aesthetic release valve against karoshi, which is the literal specter of death by overwork. It was disruption, but highly controlled disruption. And we really have to remember the stakes involved here. Being a punk in 1980s Japan wasn't just a fun, edgy weekend look. Adopting this aesthetic meant you were completely excommunicating yourself from ordinary society. If you were rocking a towering colored mohawk or heavy makeup, you were actively avoided on trains, screened completely out of the job market, and honestly, you'd even struggle to just rent an apartment. Just listen to this quote from Ishia, the frontman of the legendary Jap Corps band Death Side. He said, "In Japan, the pressure to conform is extremely strong. We were treated like enemies of society." That right there perfectly illustrates the intense alienation these kids felt. Looking different literally made you public enemy number 1. But ironically, that exact isolation is what fueled such a fiercely independent, tight-knit spirit among the scene. Totally shut out of the mainstream, these punks basically said, fine, we'll do it ourselves, and built their own self-sustaining ecosystem. They launched independent record labels like Dogma, ADK, and Selfish Records. They claimed sacred venues like Shinjuku Loft and Gundam, where the line between the aggressive performers and the audience would just completely vanish. They communicated through hardcore fanzines. They even had their own cinema. The 1982 film Burst City is this insane dystopian punk movie directed by Sogo Ishii that actually starred real bands living on a post-apocalyptic set. It perfectly captured that chaotic, high-stakes energy. Moving on to part 3, street style and DIY. Let's track how this transitions from a hardcore music scene into a world-renowned fashion movement. So Japanese youth started wholeheartedly adopting that British DIY ethos, but they filtered it through their own unique cultural lens. This raw energy actually caught the eye of British designer Vivienne Westwood, who opened her very first overseas store in Tokyo in the 80s. She found a wildly receptive audience there. From that point, areas like Harajuku transformed into these incredible cultural incubators, brilliantly mashing up punk's tartans and bondage gear with manga elements, vintage pieces, and even traditional Japanese dress. And this street-level experimentation birthed a totally robust fashion ecosystem. Take a brand like Hysteric Glamour, founded in 1984. They took core punk aesthetics, the graphic tees, the visual quotations, that gritty DIY feel, and wove them directly into everyday streetwear. It was never about just copying the UK's scene point blank. It was about meticulously curating vintage pieces and customizing denim so that your outfit became your own personal walking manifesto. All right, part 4, Architects of Fashion Descent. Now we'll look at how this raw street energy evolved into high-end, expressive haute couture. This is where things get really sophisticated. We see these brilliant architects of fashion start translating punk's underlying tension straight into garment construction. You have Rei Kawakubo of Comme des Garçons pioneering anti-fashion with heavy asymmetry, totally rejecting conventional ideas of beauty. Then Yohji Yamamoto introduces this quiet, melancholic dissidence through massive, oversized black silhouettes. And Junior Watanabe brings in technical deconstruction, literally dismantling subcultural garments and workwear just to piece them back together in a totally confrontational way. Which brings us to Jun Takahashi, the mastermind behind the legendary label Undercover. Fun fact, he actually started out playing in a Tokyo Sex Pistols cover band. As a designer, he totally flipped the script, transforming rebellion into narrative fashion. He basically asked this profound question: what if punk's true power lies not in loud destruction, but in vulnerability? He started exploring punk not just as a look, but as a deeply emotional, alienated landscape. And we're still seeing that legacy thrive today with a whole new generation of designers. Takahiro Miyashita channels solitary alienation in his work. Teppei Fujita of Selva manages to express sheer aggression through impossibly precise tailoring. Over at Cadill, Hiroaki Sueyasu uses exaggerated silhouettes to actively question gender norms, while Taya Ashida of Body Song brings this amazing experimental graphic disruption to textiles. For all of them, punk isn't a retro trend. It's a living, breathing design methodology. Finally, part 5, a permanent design language. Let's wrap up this explainer by looking at the lasting legacy of this massive cultural shift. The big takeaway for any student of fashion history is this: Japanese punk didn't just fade away into some nostalgic phase. It evolved into a permanent design language, fundamentally embedded into the cut, the proportion, and the sheer intention of Japanese fashion. Remember that proverb we talked about at the beginning? Well, the nail that stuck out didn't get hammered down after all. It got sharpened. It was honed into a globally influential design ethos that literally dictates how we understand avant-garde fashion today. So as we wrap up our study on this incredible cultural adaptation, I want to leave you with something to chew on. If punk's true power lies not in tearing things down, but in totally reconstructing them, what rules will you choose to deconstruct next? Thanks so much for hanging out with me for this explainer. And remember to always keep questioning the design of the world around you.